bit daunting to try to face a discussion of prayer in 1 hour, but we'll see what we can do. I think we've already lost a few minutes. The question arises, well, God is God, and He's going to do what He wants. He doeth whatsoever He willeth, and He shall not be asked of His doings. That's one of the divine verses. So why do we need to pray? I think that this has been answered in different ways by the Master, but essentially it's to bring our will into correspondence with His will. Abdu'l-Baha told a story years ago. He said there was a man, a Baha'i, who was always supremely happy. And he was asked why, the man was asked why he was so happy, and he said, because everything I want, God does. The Master says, so how did that come about, And the man said, well, I found out that God does whatever He wants. So I brought my will into conformity with His will, and now everything that I want works out that way. So it's an interesting formula, and one which requires, I think, a lot of thought. By the way, this subject of meditation and prayer are pretty hard to separate. They are two distinct activities, but we'll be seeing them crossing into each other these 2 days. In a statement that the Master made with regard to the question, why pray, what is the wisdom thereof? For God has established everything and execute the affairs after the best order, and He ordains everything according to a becoming measure and puts things in their proper places with the greatest propriety and perfection. Therefore, what is the wisdom in beseeching and supplicating and stating one's wants and seeking help? And the Master responded, know thou verily it is becoming of a weak one to supplicate to the strong one, and it behooveth the seeker of bounty to beseech the glorious, bountiful one. When one supplicates to his Lord, turns unto Him and seeks bounty from His ocean, this supplication is by itself a light to his heart, an illumination to his sight, a life to his soul, and an exaltation for his being. Therefore, during thy supplication to God and thy reciting, Thy name is my healing, consider how thine heart is cheered up, thy soul delighted by the spirit of the love of God, and thy mind becomes attracted to the kingdom of God. By these attractions, one's ability and capacity increase. When the vessel is widened, the water increaseth. When the thirst grows, the bounty of the cloud becomes agreeable to the taste of man. This is the mystery of supplication and the wisdom of stating one's wants, in other words, of praying to God. The verses of God have been given to us, and we have two major categories of prayers. We have the obligatory prayers on the one hand, and then we have the other prayers, which have sometimes been called occasional prayers, but I think they're constant prayers also. But you don't have absolute laws about how many times a day to say them or anything of the sort. Baha'u'llah himself talks about two pillars supporting the spiritual life, our individual spiritual life. One is fasting and the other is prayer. And he likens these to the sun and the moon. And he makes fasting the sun and obligatory prayer the moon. I think sometimes we lose track of how important fasting is. It's an annual period that we fast. But the qualities and things that are enjoined on us in the fast also bear heavily on, I want to find a quotation here for you, bear heavily on the reason for prayer in general, for obligatory prayer and so on. Shoghi Effendi is said to have cautioned the friends to be careful that the obligatory prayers don't become rote. That you say, okay, I'm going to do the noon prayer, so you do it and it's over, and later on you wonder, did I say that or not? I can't remember, because you said it and it's past and you didn't think anything about it. And he said we should meditate on the meaning of the implications of the prayers. And actually the divine verses are such that they're filled with rushing waters and divine significances. And if we pause a second, we will always find new meanings every day from this prayer. It's a fountainhead for us, if we turn to it in the right attitude. So he's talking about the fast. He says, Shoghi Effendi writes, that it's essentially a period of meditation and prayer, of spiritual recuperation, during which the believer must strive to make the necessary readjustments in his inner life and to refresh and reinvigorate the spiritual forces latent in his soul. Its significance and purpose are fundamentally spiritual in character. So fasting, he says, is symbolic and a reminder of abstinence from selfish and carnal desires. Now, in the same way that God doesn't need our prayers, he doesn't need our fasting either. Both of these he's given us as bounties for us. And we should realize how important they are, that they, as I say, they are the two sustenances of the soul. They are as eyes to the soul, Baha'u'llah says in another place. In one place he says something very intriguing about fasting. He says, fasting is like a spider web. It's not in the compilation because we weren't sure when it was translated and proposed for the compilation whether people would understand it or not. What do they think? But you know, if you think about it, the spirit of fasting catches things in the air, in the realm of the spirit, that are not caught simply by the spider all by himself. He has this web that he creates around it, and that catches divine bounties. In the same tablet, he says that it's like a dam. It stores up bounties, waters of divine bounty, and then you can draw on them throughout the year, so to speak. And I think we do feel that the influence of it following the fast, after all the efforts and things, there's a certain satisfaction that should go along with that. Obligatory prayers obviously are very important and should be said with terrific trust and confidence that they attract to us divine bounties. You remember that section in the prayer book, Shoghi Effendi's comment about the tablet of Ahmad, the obligatory prayers and healing prayer are endowed with a special potent significance by Baha'u'llah, and therefore should be said with great confidence and trust by the believers to draw the bounties from them. Regular prayer, of course, is Abdul Baha has likened it to conversation with God. The possibility that we're speaking to God. Of course, we know he's the all-hearing, the all-seeing, the all-hearing. Even though we don't see him, he sees us. And that takes an act of faith at the beginning. But gradually, there is this connection. The route, the channels are open, the route becomes easier. And when we turn in prayer to God, we feel the closeness of God. We feel the closeness of what we're really feeling is the light that Baha'u'llah is mediating to us from God, of course. And there's some pretty strong things in the writings about you can pray to God directly if you like, but it would be rather foolish to do so when you have the prayers of Baha'u'llah that are the perfect medium with which to speak to God. What does he say about them? He says that these prayers are the praise wherewith God praiseth himself. Can you find something better than that for how to speak to him? You know, you say, well, how should we pray? What should we pray? Fortunately, the manifestation of God gives us, in particular you find that in the collection of prayers and meditations by Baha'u'llah, that Shoghi Effendi translated very early on in his ministry. By these means, we can see what our attitude should be towards God. The Bab goes so far as to say that we want the will of God, we pray for the will of God out of love for him, and we're not concerned about the outcome of the prayer. That's with God. And if he's going to give you heaven because of that, fine. And if he's sending you to hell because of it, fine as well. That's a difficult state of detachment to come to. But the point is, we're not saying the prayers simply to receive rewards. We're saying it because we know that's the good pleasure of God that we should pray. Shoghi Effendi says it's important that we observe the proper times of prayers. And if you collect the various quotations from the writings, you'll find, of course, we know where there's a prayer for midnight, but also he says we should, beside reciting the verses of God, morning and evening. This is one of the obligations we have from the Kitab-i Aqdas, that we would want to recite other prayers on a regular basis. The heart should be oft turning to God, coming back to it. In fact, it becomes a question of, in the section of the True Seeker, he says that every wayward thought that we have should be consumed by the flame of his loving mention. Here's a formula to get rid of negative thoughts that do occasionally come into our minds, unfortunately, being animals that we are. Abdul says we're animals. Without the revelation of God, without the education of the manifestation, we would remain animals. And the animal is characterized by all kinds of things that are not too friendly. Sometimes we see that in each other. In fact, one of the divine verses says, "We have made some of you as tests for others." Now, I know you may not have penetrated the meaning of that yet, but this is a kind of a constant in our lives, I think. So we have all these wonderful prayers for different occasions. And all of that helps us bring our free will, which seems to be the very essence of our having been created and placed in this world. This whole creation has been made to produce true believers, to produce believers. That is, the entire universe is there. And friends, the implications of this universe are extraordinary. You realize that one dispensation back, they still didn't know. Before that of the Bab, of the dispensation of Muhammad, they just became aware that the earth goes around the sun. They thought the sun goes around the earth, After all, the earth is flat and the sun comes up, and somehow it comes up every day. It seems to be the same sun. Then we found out we're going around the sun. When I was a young man in school, they taught that by some fluke of nature and evolution, this sun had planets. And this was unique in the whole universe. There was no sign that there were any other planets anywhere. That's 50 years ago, 60 years ago. That was the standard teaching. Baha'u'llah had already gone way beyond that and opened the horizons of the people of the world with the statement that every fixed star has planets, and every planet has creatures whose numbers no man can compute. Suddenly we have the manifestation of God opening up in space an endless universe. And the statements that he says that the reason for the creation of man, the reason that you're here, is to gain spiritual wakefulness and awareness, is a universal law. So I think we'll be finding, Abdu'l-Baha says that it's the creatures in those other worlds are there for the purposes of attaining knowledge of God as well. He says they're constituted according to the chemical makeup of those particular planets. So there may be some differences in physical makeup, but I think the image and likeness of God, and even this outward form, he says this is a form to which the whole universe conforms. He also talks about endless manifestations of God. He talks about just on our planet alone, universal cycles before the one that we're in. In other words, both in history and time and in space, all the limits have been shattered. We don't know how to even approach that. But he tells us that we've been placed in this world of darkness at the beginning for us, so that we might come to appreciate light. And all of the negative things that we think, for instance, illness, is so that we could recognize health. If there were never any illness, how would you know what health is? So through this variety of darkness and light and good and evil, we come to understand what the purpose of God is, the bounty of God, and He invites us to reflect His light. And He tells us that it's hidden within us, it's latent within us. How shall we awaken it? And it's through a life of devotion, of prayer, of service, all these closely related, as we'll see in the course of the week here, and you already know from your own studies of the writings. We become aware, and we fulfill what the Bob says. He said, God has given us free will in order that we might choose the will of God. And then he adds, any other use of this power of free will, is illicit. It's not made for, you say free will, so I can choose what I like. That's what God is, yeah, He's done it. But one of the things results in life and heavenly bounties and awareness, and the other results in all kinds of disasters and the animal nature of man ruling over us. It's like as a man who, the spirit of man is like the rider and the horse is like the body. And any of you that have ridden horses, you know that you have to have the horse under control, or the horse will take you off where you don't want to go. And he may throw you off as well, you don't know. So we have to know the rules of riding, and then the mount becomes the means of our ascending to magnificent heights under full control of the body that we've been given. So we move gradually by stages through acts of prayer, acts of service, as the house is calling us to constantly be thinking of how our devotions will result in actions, in good actions, and how the greatest of all actions is delivering the message of Baha'u'llah to other souls. Through that we see the outcome of a life of devotion and prayer. In confirmation of that, we have a message of the Guardian where he says, teaching is the source of divine confirmation. It's not sufficient to pray diligently for guidance, but this prayer must be followed by meditation. As to the best methods of action, meditation adds to the best methods of action, and then action itself. And certainly this process is that we see in these various 5-year plans of reflecting on the result of what we're doing and then deciding what is the appropriate action after that is right in line with this pattern. Even if action should not produce results immediately, or perhaps not be entirely correct, that does not make so much difference, because prayers can only be answered through action. And if someone's action is wrong, God can use that method of showing the pathway which is right. So not worrying too much about getting it exactly right. Put yourself in motion and then He's able to guide you. I remember when I was a brand new Baha'i, they said, you have to start the car and start driving, then you can get guidance. Don't sit there with the car engine off and ask for guidance, which way to turn and where to go. It seemed like good advice to me. The Master assured us that when we forget ourselves and strive with all our powers to serve and teach the faith, we receive divine assistance. It is not we who do the work, but we are the instruments used at that time for the purpose of teaching His cause. So the divine plan is something that's in the charge of God. He's got the Master has given it and He's watching over it, and the role of Baha'u'llah is the supreme ordainer for all aspects of it. When we can conform our will to the will of God, then He uses us in the way that we need to be used at that time in our lives. And this is a wonderful confirmation for us to know this. I remember surveying, thinking about having been at the World Center, excuse me for a personal comment here, been there for 39 years, and I was leaving, I was thinking, well, that's wonderful. Then I was reading a tablet of the Master, and I found this verse there that I had never seen before. Abdu'l-Baha says, the service of the friends belongs to God, not to them. Interesting point, huh? Anything that we manage to do that's good or in line with God's purpose He has assisted us to do. The animal self of its own can never produce anything good. The lower self of man is incapable. He will have always mixed emotions or motives, you know. So many people try to live a life of virtue and appear good to others without belief in God. Abdu'l-Baha says this is no help for the progress of the soul. It's a kind of a secret pride. I'm able to fool the public that I'm a very lovely, wonderful person, you know. It's ego. So we should know that anything that we manage to do that has a good result is because of his assistance. And that's why we constantly ask for his assistance. We try to open those channels within ourselves so that we can serve others and touch them in a way that will be in conformity with the purpose of God. And this is why Baha'i speakers are said that they should depend on, Abdu'l-Baha says, turn to me and I will inspire you what to say. Of course, the source from which we take what to say is to some degree, not entirely, but to some degree dependent on how much we have studied the cause. We've deepened in the literature of the faith so that we have that subconsciously, we have it within us, Shoghi Effendi says. So when the Holy Spirit comes and inspires us, out comes something from the writings. Otherwise, out comes something maybe very kind and nice and loving, but not too helpful. So we want to, on the one hand, we can't deny that the Divine Spirit can move anybody with whatever degree of knowledge they have, and this is why Shoghi Effendi and the House of Justice is telling us, move right away when you're a Baha'i, take action, try to do things, be of service, try to teach the faith. I remember in Nicaragua, the first Baha'i in Bluefields, which was this sleepy little tropical town on the edge of a rainforest, where I landed as a pioneer in 1958. The first Baha'i, who recently passed away with great honors, a simple fellow, had a bit of a farming patch, and he lived in the town. He was very excited about the cause. He heard about it. We told him about Baha'u'llah. By that time, there were some other pioneers around. And he would go out, and he knew he was supposed to teach. So he'd go out and he'd say, you know, there's a new religion. And they'd say, yes, what's the name of it? He said, I can't remember the name. But it's been brought by a new messenger of God. Oh, they said, what's the name of the messenger? Really couldn't tell you. But I know who can tell you. I can take you to the people that can tell you. And he would bring people to us constantly, and we would teach the cause. Now, look at, that's pretty minimum knowledge of the faith, you know. But the man was on fire with it. It was incredible. And he stayed firm until he passed away, as I say, with honors now in his 80s or something. I remember Dr. Muhajir telling us, the hand of the cause. He'd been teaching in the Mentawai Islands, and whole tribes had come into the faith. And then he, as the hand, he was appointed and required to move internationally. He moved around. Shoghi Effendi had been very pleased with the beginning of the mass teaching in the Pacific area, in this Indonesian islands. And the government sent out census takers throughout Indonesia to take the census. And when they came, they said, okay, your village is a Muslim village, is that right? They said, no. I said, well, not Muslim village? What is it? He said, we have a new religion. What religion is that? He said, doctor's religion. And who's the prophet? Doctor's prophet. So Dr. Muhajir said we had to do a little bit of, consolidation and deepening when we went back to get the thing on solid ground. Of course, now there's wonderful Baha'i schools in those areas. And by the way, I just had a press clipping this morning that said Indonesia has recognized the Baha'i faith officially as a religion after decades of oppression. So many of the Baha'i teachers have been jailed there, and difficulties. You hear it's not as bad as Iran, but they had their hard times, and it was difficult living. And now suddenly this has opened up. And we knew from the time that I was in Haifa that some of the leaders of Indonesia, some of the heads of the great parties were aware of Baha'u'llah and were recognizing the beneficent influence of his teachings. So, yes, on the one hand, we have to pray and we have to study in order to deliver the message. On the other hand, we have to depend and know that the bounty of God and the blessing of God is the means of us being able to accomplish anything, that we don't accomplish it by ourselves, and we can't take, dangerous for us to take pride in the fact that we know the Baha'i history very well, or I don't have much pride in that area because I don't remember the history very well, but this is important for us to have these sources of inspiration, but realize, as it says very clearly, Baha'u'llah says in a verse in the Gleanings, all good comes from God, and all evil from your own selves. It's a bit startling because we're living in a time of glorification of the me society, and we want to do things for us and to make ourselves happy and so on. It's really a distortion of what Baha'u'llah is saying to us. And we have to renounce our own desires and passions, and we have to bring our affections, those things that move our will, that give us the desire to change, we have to orient those to the verses of God. And the daily influence of the prayers, obligatory prayers, and the repetition of the verses morning and evening hones this process for us, develops it so that the divine bounties can flow into us, or flow out of us, if you will, because they're already in us. And ultimately, this process is the act of martyrdom, but it's a living martyrdom. It's sacrificing ourselves for His will, becoming instruments of His purpose. And the source of great happiness, the source of infinite knowledge, Abdullah promises, is to bring our will into conformity with His will. There's nothing greater than that, so to speak. Friends, the reward is mighty, the path is not easy, but when we ask for God's help, He sends help to us. And sometimes that help is not in the form that you would welcome if you knew ahead of time. Because He tests us, He profoundly tests us. But He says He doesn't test us beyond our capacity. But He does send the next thing we need to learn in order to advance. And one of the things the Master says is that God sends us a test, and I think everybody in the room will know which test matches this scenario in your lives. That is a failing that you have, something you repeat that you shouldn't repeat, or something you do that you shouldn't do, or a way you act that is not appropriate for a Baha'i, so that thing comes to your attention. So you say, okay, I've identified that. Well and good, I'll work on that. I will work on it. I pray, give me strength, The test comes back, I fail it again. It gets a bit boring after a while, Okay, God, I'm gonna fix this, I promise. No. Abdullah says you fail it again and again and again until you become, and this is the essence of this thing, you become desperate and you realize you cannot overcome that shortcoming. At which place at that time, he said, you throw yourself on the mercy of God and you beg Him to take this from me because it's the cause of my not growing anymore, not developing in the cause. Help me, I can't get rid of it. I've tried. We can't solve it. He has to solve it. Then Abdullah says, God comes to your assistance, and that test is lifted. Behind it is standing the grim face of the next one that you will quickly identify also. And maybe you think you can resolve that by yourself now, but it doesn't work. You have to. This is the weak one supplicating to the strong one, the realization that we cannot do this on our own. And then depending, trusting, depending and leaning on Him. Abdullah says in one place, he says, if your life is too difficult, if you're surrounded by too many difficulties, he says, lean on me. This is so sweet of the way the Master says this. Lean on me, so I can put your head on His shoulder and take comfort. whatever difficulties are surrounding you, and there'll be plenty, as we know. I wanted to go back a little bit to the story of Leonore Armstrong that I was telling you. Leonore Halsapple, she became Armstrong later when she married a British gentleman who wasn't a Baha'i but sponsored all her activities for years, until finally in his last decade he became a Baha'i as well. She was very modest and humble, and she said, you know, I'm not a speaker, I'm not a public speaker, or not a teacher really, and I would beg all the time, you know, to Baha'u'llah and the Master to assist me. And she said, I've never told anybody, but I want to confess something to you. I was a counselor coming back and forth, so she took some confidence in that. And she said, you know, I'll tell you what I did. She said, because I couldn't speak, I memorized talks of Abdul Baha and tablets of Baha'u'llah, and I would give those, I would speak those out. And it seemed to work very well, she said. But I always felt bad. I thought, I should be speaking, you know, myself. So I was able to tell her that I had heard a story from the Guardian, actually in the form of a pilgrim note, where he said there were 3 levels of Baha'i teachers. The Baha'i teachers went through 3 different stages. The first stage, he said, is you're attracted to the faith, but probably you like better one teaching of the cause or one principle more than the others. So he said, whenever you speak about the cause, you will deliver that principle because that's the one that you're most convinced and familiar with. And then you'll add, he said, some ideas of your own to make it more interesting, you know. Effective, but not too effective. And also it doesn't conform with Abdu'l-Baha's formula that you should look at the seeker, you should investigate and hear from the seeker so that you know out of the great medicine chest of Baha'u'llah's guidance and tablets, which remedy to give first. There's some remedies in there, if you give them first, it kills the poor person, the patient, you know, like one place here, Shogyafindi says, he would advise you not necessarily to start with such a difficult topic as no wine. I'm going to interrupt it and go and I'll come back to this story, but I want to say something about Dr. Muhajir in South America. He was with us, we all met, the counselors met with him in Peru years ago. That would have been in the late 60s. And we had a press conference, very successful press conference, and then we had a public meeting. And the public meeting was about the size of this gathering here. A lot of Peruvians were there. And he gave a talk, a 20-minute talk, which became 40 minutes with a translation. I was a translator, going back and forth from English to Spanish. It was such a brilliant talk. It was so fresh. Because he was concentrated, constantly moving, teaching the cause, he had this flow of inspiration. It was out of this world. That talk was it left the audience, I would say, homogenized. It was just so nice and creamy, and the whole audience was there. So the chairman of the NSA was the chairman of the meeting. He said, will he take questions? So I asked him between ways, okay, if there are any questions. I wouldn't have thought there should be any questions. A man in the 3rd row with a big red nose. Yes? What about wine? I didn't want to translate even to tell the hand what he'd said. He says, what was the question? What about wine? He said, oh, what a good question. Thank you so much. He said, the Baha'i teachings are full of references to wine. You see them in all the Baha'i books. The wine of astonishment, the wine of the love of God, the wine of divine knowledge, all these wonderful wines. He said, the Baha'i faith is really about that. And he said, and if you manage to taste any of those, you won't care about the other kind. Next question. Brilliant, huh? God can help us and use, as the Master says in one place, our mistakes to advance the cause. Don't be too upset if you don't get it right, you're trying. And sincere efforts. He can make out of sincere efforts victories for the cause. That's a whole volume by itself, I suppose we could write. This the first stage of teacher was that one where we favorite principle and an elaboration of our own ideas about the emancipation of women or one universal language, and probably should be Esperanto, and I don't know, the different things, the different phases that people have gone through. The second stage, he said, is when the believer faces the literature of the cause, studies it to the point where when he speaks, in his own words, he conveys the reality of the case, the truth of the cause. In other words, he gets the teachings right and in a more balanced form. Second stage of teaching, quite more effective than the first stage. But then he said there's the highest stage of teaching, and this was the one I was savoring to deliver to Leonora. He says the third stage of the teaching is when you get to the point where you're so familiar with the writings that you've memorized passages, and in your presentation the original writings come out. And he says, of course, this is the most effective because these words have a power of penetration to the human heart. And that's the highest degree, he said, of the teachers of the cause. Well, she looked modestly pleased about that. Then she told me a story about going to the Amazon. This is a small, very modest lady. She said, I took a boat from Belen in the mouth of the Amazon and worked my way up the Amazon River, would stop at these little towns and so on. I saw later newspaper clippings. Angel of Light visits our town. She got off she would attract the population like crazy. And she said, I didn't know what to do. They were asking me for blessings and remedies and everything. Somehow it had gone ahead that she was such a saintly soul. And of course she was. The Master says that if you're going to teach the faith, you should become incarnate light. Huh? Head to foot, you should be glowing. Oh, that was Leonora. She just glowed. She glowed in the dark, actually. So she's moving up there and she's causing this excitement all along the way. And she said, I had aspirins I gave to people sometimes, very sick people. And I would pray, oh, Allah, help these people, son. So she said, finally I got to Manaus. Manaus is the capital of the Amazon, a city of about 50,000 people in those days. It was following the First World War, and that had been the center of rubber exportation. And so there was lots of money available, and there were rubber barons that had mansions there. And they were bored being so far away from Europe and from America that they built a replica of the Paris Opera House in Manaus. Can you imagine? It's still there. Beautiful thing. So Leonora said, I got to Manaus. I said, did you know anybody? She said, no, I didn't know. I didn't have any reference to anybody. I didn't know anybody there. She'd been in Bahia before that, in Salvador, Bahia, for some years. So now this is 1922, it's the Guardian's time. She goes there, she said, so what did you do? So she said, well, I followed Martha Root's example. I went to see the mayor. And I told him I'd come to the city and I wanted to proclaim this faith, and the faith was, the basic teachings were this and that. And he said, that's very good. To inform the population, we should call a meeting where you can speak to the people. She says, well, I knew what that meant in my heart. I'd have to repeat these tablets and things that I knew. And she said, to my surprise, he made general announcements to the population that I would be speaking one day later in the evening at the Opera House. We all know about public meetings, So I had experiences where you announce a public meeting and very few people come. But she said the place was full. And they had a translator, and she delivered the message. About 2,000 people. Imagine. I mean, the kind of confirmations that you line yourself up right with what he wants, as I think to me, that was about as close an example of a life that was lived that way that I have ever seen. And so how did it go? She said it went very well. They were very happy. Well, what happened after that? Well, she said there was a study class that was formed so that we could talk more about it. And I said, oh, did people come to that? She said, yes, not so many, about 400. So she was giving this, and of course, at that time, friends, there wasn't anything called declaration. I mean, if you liked the faith, you said, I'm a Baha'i, and that was it. So there wasn't any, still the administrative order had not started to penetrate into those areas. So she had a lot of enthusiasts. And she went back on another trip. She would write the Guardian when she was down in spirits and ask for prayers. So most of his letters are answering, say, rest assured, the seeds you're planting will give marvelous fruits in the future. Don't have any doubt of that. Constantly reassuring her. But she didn't write him that she's been up the Amazon. It's not in Baha'i world. Now it's in her biography, yes, all the marvelous things that she did. She was, the Guardian said, I want you to translate the Igon to Portuguese and then to Spanish. Well, she said, I knew Portuguese, but I didn't know any Spanish. So I wondered how I prayed about that. And she said, I knew there was a monastery, a nunnery, for the nuns, for Spanish nuns in Bahia. So she said, I went to them, and the Mother Superior received me. And I said, I had this translation that I needed to have corrected by Spanish speakers. And I was wondering if they could help. And she looked at a few pages of it, and she said, we could help, but I can't give the manuscript to any one of these nuns. I can give 1 page, and then after 5 pages, another page, and after 5, so they can't get the gist of it, She said, that would be fine. So that was the result of that, was the first Spanish translation of the Kitab-i Igan. And Leonora got it printed and sent it all over South America to the Theosophists and other organizations that she knew would be interested in receiving it. Late in her life, I was staying with her, and she had adopted, in the course of her days, about 12 children that she'd raised. Amazing. And she still had a very obstreperous little 8-year-old. Was really a terror, this kid. Anyway, she was managing, and one of her earlier children was living with them, and she would help to take care of this little boy, and her husband was still alive at that point. And she said, I get up at 6 and I'm busy with the affairs of the day. She had a farm. She would bring produce from the farm into the city and so on. She owned apartments and everything. This was in the later stages of her life. And she said, then I finish all my duties about 9 o'clock in the evening, she said. And that's when I start my translation work. And she says, I'm sorry to confess, she said, I'm getting older and weaker. She was nearly 70 at that time. And she said, I would generally go to 3:30 and then go to bed and get up at 6. And she said, lately I haven't been able, I've had to stop at 3. And she asked me what I thought of that, and I wanted to die. My own life, I was going to bed early in the evening and not doing that kind of thing. So sweet. If you can get her biography, I suggest that you look at it. It's a wonderful example. Now, back to this question of a life of devotion, of prayer, and attending to the will of God, and reading the verses of God so that those particular parts of our brain and our consciousness that we have acquired from others in the course of our lives, first from our beloved parents who don't always get it right, and then by school children, and finally by the teachers in the school, and then by our peers when we're teenagers, until we reach the age of 16 where we know everything, and then 17 when we find out we didn't really. So all of these phases of life, we acquire knowledge, and we have a very different outlook. If you travel around the world very much, you see that the people have different ways of viewing life because of what they've inherited from their surroundings. Then we have the media on top of that, and we have the literature, general literature in the countries where we live. So all these things telling us what life is about and how we should think and how we should understand. And even science, which should be the source of knowledge to us, oftentimes is engaged in theories and ideas which don't conform to the divine word immediately, like the question of no planets except here, and now we know that the universe is filled with billions of planets. So all of that needs to be gradually replaced by attention to the divine word, reciting the words of God, reading the words of God. It's as if it removes bad cells and puts good ones in its place. And from, the question of crystallization, Shoghi Effendi talks about the New World Order crystallizing in the consciousness of the world. So likewise, our own Baha'i life, our own relationship with God crystallizes within our consciousness as we apply the salts to this murk of our inherited consciousness and the one we've borrowed from everybody else. The salts of the verses of God, of the revelation, gradually bring it to the point where it crystallizes. And that's a new stage of our existence. Remember, he says that the soul is a heavenly gem. The quality of the gem is that it reflects light and it also refracts light in new ways. So the excitement that comes when our consciousness is clarified through a life of prayer and meditation and service, gradually as that new consciousness comes into being, then we're assisted to perform, I think, services of a much greater order than we previously could even conceive of. And so this is the reason that we need to devote ourselves to our prayer books, to the knowledge and study of the writings that we'll talk about on another day. And tomorrow we'll look a little bit more at the question of meditation. What's the difference between prayer and meditation, and where should it lead us?